We'd like to thank you all for coming out this afternoon. We have some refreshments in the back. You're welcome to at any time or afterwards. We have a wonderful program getting ready to come up here. There are a few announcements. Those of you that are interested in genealogy, we're having the Genealogical Society of Southern Illinois has this meeting tomorrow, December 6th, at John A. Logan College Library. Next week at this time, we'll be having a Christmas program, and there'll be some information coming up about that. And we thank you all for coming out on this rainy day. We was kind of worried we might be just 4 or 5. So, I would like to introduce our PR chairman, Ms. Cheryl Trent.
What this proves to me is the power of Dr. John Jackson. So let's give him, because we really did think the rain might affect us today. We're very pleased. Do we have any first-time visitors to our Herrin Area Historical Society program? One. Raise your hand big. We send you, all of you, a very special welcome, and we hope that you will come again. We even had our mayor. We have a new acting mayor in the city of Herrin, and he just came over specifically to extend his greeting to our program leader today. Next Friday, a week from today at 2 o'clock, if you have a voice and you like to sing, we hope you'll come to the Energy First Baptist Church, where it's going to be our holiday party. We'll have refreshments, and we're going to have some great musicians from the Historical Society and some from the city of Herrin. And we'd like you all to come. That will be our last program until either January or February. We also will have at that program next Friday a donation box. And the city of Herrin, those of you who've been on the Herrin Massacre programs, know that the city of Herrin has stepped up. We've found the bodies. Now we would like to have a grave marker, a commemorative marker at Herrin City Cemetery. And the city has pledged X number of dollars, but it's not enough. So we hope that big history buffs will step up to the plate. And you can do that at Herrin City Hall. Those of you who know me can give me a check or money, but it will be made to Herrin City Government. You can put in your memo for the marker for the miners at Herrin City Cemetery. So we hope that you might consider that. Gordon Pruitt is our program chair, as well as serving on our board of directors, and he has brought some really excellent program speakers to our table for the Historical Society. And this is one of my favorite parts of the Historical Society. If you agree with me, clap your hands so we can have more programs. But we get a real, I know I just spoke to a gentleman from Benton. We have several people here from Carbondale. And it seems we bring a lot of people to our wonderful little city of Herrin. So we appreciate your coming. We hope you'll come back here and shop and eat at our restaurants. So Gordon Pruitt, who is with the SIU Alumni Association, who used to be with Morris Library, will introduce John Jackson to us. And I know it will be a very interesting program. Gordon Pruitt.
Thank you, Cheryl. Today's guest is a native of Waldo, Arkansas, who came to SIU Carbondale in September 1969 as an instructor in what is now the Department of Political Science. To put things in perspective as to how long John has been in the area, in that same month, Cardinals pitcher Steve Carlton set a Major League Baseball record by striking out 19 New York Mets in one game. The trial of the Chicago 8, the protesters at the Democratic National Convention, began. The Beatles released their Abbey Road album, which was their next to last album. And I entered my senior year at Herrin High School with a full head of hair. John Jackson has been an assistant professor, an associate professor, and in 1978 he became a full professor. For 11 years he was the dean of the College of Liberal Arts, one of the largest colleges on campus. He served as vice chancellor for academic affairs and provost from 96 to 99. And in June of '99, he became the 17th chancellor of the Carbondale campus. Since 2002, he's been a visiting professor with the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute, and throughout his time in Carbondale, he's been the media's go-to darling for the best insights and the clearest sound bites on local, state, and national political races. John is remarkably in his 6th decade of service to Southern, and seemingly the only way the state's pension crisis can be averted is to prevent John's retiring and to keep him working at the public policy. He directs the Institute's internship programs and edits the Simon Review series, to which he's a frequent contributor. He is also the editor of the recently released book, The Essential Paul Simon, Timeless Lessons for Today's Politics, published by SIU Press, and is the author of the just released The American Political Party System, Continuity and Change Over 10 Presidential Elections, which has been published by the prestigious Brookings Institution Press. Ladies and gentlemen, John Jackson.
Thank you, Gordon. I'm also going to ask him to do double duty as my teaching assistant here and hand out the handouts for the day. I can't do these things without either a PowerPoint or handouts, and PowerPoints can go down on you, the electricity can go out or it goof up, and if you bring it in hard copy, then you've got it. It's going to be a little tough to follow along, though. I hope you will. Just turn through the pages with me as we go through. And I'll take just a moment to thank Gordon for his good work, and Cheryl. I think it's tribute to both of them that on a dark and rainy Friday afternoon we've got a room full of people here. I want to tell you briefly my small world Herrin, Illinois connection, beyond the fact that Nancy, my wife, who's right over here, and I have lived next door in Carbondale since 1969. But way before I even thought about moving to SIU and coming to Carbondale, I knew a little bit about Herrin, Illinois, because I went to a small Baptist college in central Illinois in a town called Arkadelphia, Arkansas. And in that political science program there was an instructor named Jim Rankino. And I got to know Jim after I graduated, actually, because I had already gone off both to graduate school and to the U.S. Army when Jim was there. But I went back as often as possible to see our mutual friend who was chair of the department named Bob Riley. And in that back and forth, I got to know Jim and his wife well. And I bring that up not only because of the Herrin, Illinois connection, and of course knew for years that there were some Rankinos left over here in Herrin, and I'm delighted to have met Cheryl for the first time today. But also Jim did for the whole state of Illinois something of what we at the Institute do in terms of public opinion polling and political commentary. That is, he was the state's leading political pollster, and he was also the state's leading political commentator. He was famous all across Arkansas because of the television stations all in Little Rock, which was 67 miles north of there. And so he was always up there talking about politics. And I like to think that what we do, Charlie Leonard particularly, and I was my co-author on this paper, is a little like that. Because I'm going to talk about the elections, which is the advertised topic, but I want to put them in the context of the public opinion data that we've gathered over the years and what it teaches us about both Illinois and Southern Illinois. You may not know, but we do at least one statewide survey and one Southern Illinois survey every year. Occasionally, we've even done 2 statewide surveys, and we particularly focus on upcoming political campaigns, political issues, and especially, of course, given our charge and our name at the Public Policy Institute, we focus on public policy. And that paper is sort of the culmination of 5 years' worth of work where Charlie Leonard and I pulled it all together and tried to say what it means, and of course, I'm going to use that as the statewide context, and I'm going to supplement it with stuff that you don't have, which is the results of the Southern Illinois polls. And just very briefly, these are random samples of registered voters throughout the state. We use live interviewers. We don't use recordings. We have 35% cell phones, which are tougher to get and more expensive. But if you don't do cell phones, you're not doing justice to the idea of random sampling. And we like to think we do very good survey research and that we meet all the standards. We usually do 1,000 on the interview base, and that gives you what's called plus or minus 3.5 on the error factor. So I'm not going to bore you with any more of the details, but that's what we do, and some of the ways in which we can prove that our polls are pretty good have always worked out, and we think we do good polling over there. We're interested in documenting the views and values of the people of Illinois and of the people of Southern Illinois. And I hope I can pull all that together. It's going to get into the weeds just a little bit. You can follow along, though, with these frequency distributions and these tables that I've built into this. I'm going to hit the highlights. I don't want to overdo it and wear you out with the tiny little numbers, and the numbers are tiny, especially if you're getting older and having trouble seeing some of these numbers, but I think the numbers say what I'm going to claim they say, and you can take them home and look at them. We start, if you would, look at Table 1, page 3. We start with a typical right track, wrong track. This is taken, usually national surveys do this sort of thing. And generally the voters say that the country's on the wrong track by about a 2-to-1 margin. Sometimes it gets to be even a 3-to-1 margin. And Illinois voters are no different from that, as Table 1, page 3 shows quite clearly. The only time it was even close on right track, wrong track was 2012 and 2013, but then by 2014 it had turned back negative, much more of the wrong track rather than the right track. Now you may not know, but we've been doing these kinds of questions for many, many years. It doesn't really matter who's in the White House or who's in charge of Congress. American public's always dyspeptic, always mad about the direction of the country, and by 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 margin will say the nation's going to hell in a handbasket, basically. Which gives you some perspective, actually, makes you wonder a little bit about why are we so angry, why are we so dyspeptic, and why are we so skeptical about our government. I think that has really become sort of the default value in the American culture, that we're just angry all the time. And that's all you heard during the last election, how mad the voters were. Well, I've been watching elections pretty carefully since at least 1960, and that has been the major narrative for almost all of them. I grew up in the American South where we hated the federal government, and we still hate the federal government down there. I mean, you know, we are not aware that that war is over yet, and certainly that we lost it has not trickled through in the part of Arkansas where I grew up anyway. And I think it's reinforced by a lot of cultural values. I think it's reinforced by the mass media, particularly outlets like Fox Network News, talk radio. That's all you hear is angry people. If you take the trouble to listen to talk radio, as I sometimes do when I'm driving from place to place. And it's especially exacerbated, and these numbers are worse a little bit more recently because of the recession. These numbers are always aggravated when they're hard economic times. We, of course, had just come off the Great Recession of 2008-2009, and that economic recession and the aftermath were still very much with us in the 2014 election, even though that's really now 6-7 years out and has changed pretty dramatically in terms of the real numbers. I follow a lot of public opinion pollsters. One is Rasmussen, which actually is a bit of a Republican lean pollster. Rasmussen asks every week whether or not the country thinks we're in a recession. And the answer has been yes by more than a majority since 2009 when the recession technically ended. So for all practical purposes, more than a majority of the American people believe that we're still in a recession. Never mind that the economy added more than 200,000 private sector jobs every month since January of this year. The new data you may not have seen came out today. We added 321,000 private sector jobs in the month of November. But people don't pay attention to that as far as many people, more than a majority, are concerned. We're still in a recession. And I bring that up because I think it was the major context in which the national elections and the state of Illinois and the southern Illinois elections were held. And I think, too, the White House and the Democrats missed a real opportunity to stress the reality rather than the perception, which is almost all of the indicators are massively better on the economic front in 2014 than they were in 2008, 2009, in the depth of what we now call the Great Recession. I think they were afraid of that for two reasons. One is they were afraid of sort of the blowback that they would get, because there are still a fair number of people unemployed. 5.8 is the current unemployment rate nationwide, 6.8 in terms of the state of Illinois, so we were +1 in regard to the state versus the national. I think the other thing was the Democrats were terrified of what's called nationalizing the elections. They wanted a series of particularly congressional House district and state or U.S. Senate at the state level to be about local and state issues and what that senator, what that incumbent House member had done, what they had done for the region, what they had done for the home folks, bringing home the bacon, all of them playing like they're Kenny Gray and all the good stuff that they had brought in terms of being the Prince of Pork. That's not just Southern Illinois, that's the way it works in virtually every House district in the United States. And the Democrats wanted to focus on that. They wanted to keep it local, and they failed abysmally. They had no theme, they had no national message, and they basically just couldn't get it together in terms of what story they wanted to tell. And the other story was that we're in deep economic stress and people are mad and people are going to take it out, particularly on Obama and the White House. Again, never mind that this is a midterm election and the president's not going to run again. He wasn't on the ballot, but typically that's the way it works in midterm elections. So that by way of my theory about the critical role of jobs in the economy, I think that is a fundamental part of what happened both nationally, statewide, and locally on November the 4th. If you would look at figure 1, which is page 4 next, this is what's called a crosstab, and it simply tells you that partisanship makes a great deal of difference on how you view these things. More recently, Democrats are much more likely to say right track than wrong track. Republicans are much more likely to say wrong track than right track, and the independents are in between. And if you had taken this poll in 2006 when George Bush was in the White House, the exact opposite would have obtained. That is, Democrats were much more angry and upset because George Bush and the Republicans were in the White House. So again, back to my sort of this is the default value in terms of our political culture, no matter who's in the White House. Very quickly, if you'll look at figure 2, which is page 5 next, this is right track, wrong track for the state of Illinois. In this one, party also matters, but not as much. That is, the Democrats are also critical, not as critical as the Republicans, but Democrats are more likely to say right track at a much lower level than they were for the national. The Republicans are consistent. They're upset at the national level and upset at the state level. And again, the independents fall almost exactly in between. The general view, I think, that pollsters and pundits and people like me take from this, though, is this is an assessment of sort of the prospective assessment of how things are going, how they might be likely to vote, and there is indeed a fairly high correlation with voting behavior. And looking at all of these kinds of data before the election, I concluded fairly early and fairly consistently that Governor Quinn, for example, was likely to be in some fairly serious difficulty with respect to his re-election prospects. Now, that's kind of glum so far in terms of the way we look at the world. The one brighter spot is, in our data and consistently, If you ask about how your local city is doing and your local area is doing, which is figure 3, page 7, it's a good deal better. We're pretty sanguine about the way things are going in here in Illinois and in Carbondale. Well, maybe not Carbondale, but at least and here the gap between the Democrats and the Republicans is not nearly as great. The Democrats are still more favorable, but not by nearly the margin. The usual generalization you might imagine is the closer you get to home and the closer you get to local government, the more positive people are about government. And that's usually then more critical at the federal level, somewhat more critical but lesser at the state level, and then much more positive at the local level. The exception in our data is the state of Illinois is way worse in the evaluation than the nation as a whole, which is different for Illinois. And again, you might conclude this is not good news for Pat Quinn if he's looking for re-election. We all know how that turned out, but we were looking at these data before the election at the time. Now, Southern Illinois results, we're almost exactly like that. Right direction for the nation is 14.9 in Southern Illinois. Wrong direction for the nation is 74%. We were not very sanguine in Southern Illinois about the direction of the nation. Right direction for the state, you don't have these. You needn't scramble around. I'm telling you what other poll data say. Right direction for the state in Southern Illinois was only 10%. 83% wrong direction. We were not a bunch of happy campers down here. We were more negative in evaluating the state than the state as a whole was. In fact, we were the area more negative than any other area. And not surprisingly, Southern Illinois Republicans were the most negative of all in all of our samples. Right direction for the city, on the other hand, or area in which you live, we in Southern Illinois, 52% right direction, 38% wrong direction. So again, in Southern Illinois, we like our local areas quite all right. Now, let me shift from right direction, wrong direction to a series of reform questions. We at the Institute have been interested in a number of reform possibilities for a long time, so we've been studying reform proposals, and one or two of them we're even advocates for. Term limits, for example, is always heavily favored and is heavily favored in all of these data points that I've offered. It's roughly about 70% every time we measure approval of term limits. People like the idea of term limits. Southern Illinois voters, interestingly enough, were slightly lower on approval of term limits than the statewide voters were. It's only about 5%, and it's not what I expected, given what I've already said, but we were still massively in favor of term limits. It just wasn't at quite as high a rate. I raised term limits first because if you'll remember the campaign, Governor-elect Rauner ran heavily on term limits, and he used it particularly effectively and I think shrewdly to stand out in the crowd in the Illinois Republican primary. You'll remember he ran against 3 veteran Republicans, all of whom had run statewide before, all of whom were very serious people and very serious candidates, and he beat them all. And one thing he did was to fund the term limit movement, and he got a lot of good mileage out of that. Got enough money that he could fund that as well as his own campaign, and he used that movement, and I'm sure his people pay a lot of people a lot of money to do the kinds of surveys we do, and those people were finding term limits is wildly popular in Illinois, and it was a good thing for him to be out in front of. Now, point number 2 under term limits is table 2B, which is page 10. This is term limits for legislative leaders. If you would like to read that, in other words, Michael Madigan, I think it would be justified to put that in the blank there. And certainly people think of Michael Madigan first when they think of statewide legislative leaders. 82.7% statewide want term limits for legislative leaders. That's easily done. All the legislature has to do to vote in favor of it. Well, not so easy maybe, but that's the way it gets done anyway. Favored in Southern Illinois by 83%, so we were about 1% higher on term limits for legislative leaders. How about money raised and issued by state legislative leaders in order to help their favorite local candidate running for the state legislature? That's table 2C, which is page 11. 62% of us statewide favor that. 59% of those of us in Southern Illinois favor that. You probably appreciate this is one of the ways in which the 4 legislative leaders, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, have become extremely powerful within their caucuses within the state of Illinois. The state legislature is heavily dominated by the caucuses and by the legislative leadership, and one of the key reasons is campaign finance and where the money comes from. How about open primaries? This is a primary where you don't have to claim partisanship. Everybody understands that in Illinois you have to ask for a Republican or a Democratic ballot. 70 to 75% consistently favor open primaries. That's table 2B, which is page 11. In Southern Illinois, almost exactly the same. 75% of us, 3/4 of us in Southern Illinois are in favor of open primaries. 17% are opposed. Yeah.
I was just curious if there was also a breakout of that by moderates, Democrats, and Republicans. If there was a big difference in that.
We have that. I can't tell you just off the top of my head. I can get that. I'm sure we have it. I don't know the answer just offhand. It's a decent point and one that certainly we've looked at. Redistricting. We at the Institute think redistricting is at the heart of many of the things that are basically wrong with or not going so well in the American political system. The current plan in Illinois is an odd and unusual one. Let's just say the parties tend to dominate redistricting on both sides. The leadership tends to dominate the process, and when we get down to a certain point, we flip a coin. Some of you know this. It's the only state in the nation where we solve the redistricting dilemma by flipping a coin and adding one more person to the commission that does redistricting, and the Democrats win all or the Republicans win all. When we explain all that, it takes about a paragraph to explain it. People say, well, that's stupid, and about 75% say, no, we're opposed to that. And in Illinois, it's exactly the same. 75% in Illinois are opposed to the current constitutionally defined system for the way we do redistricting. Well, what could we do different? A lot of states do this differently. One of the things we've advocated at the Paul Simon Institute is that the Supreme Court in the state of Illinois be allowed to add an additional person rather than the partisan leadership adding that additional person. They would be called a special master added because of their technical expertise, not because of their partisanship. When we offer that option, 74% in Illinois and 71% statewide favor our alternative way of doing it. Now, table 2G, which is page 14. 2 or 3 or 4 states in this last cycle shifted to a nonpartisan, sort of neutral and technical commission. It's an independent as independent can be. State of California, for example, the state of Arizona, for example, have recently moved to this kind of redistricting. When we offered that possibility, 2/3 of the voters of Illinois and 65% of the voters of Southern Illinois favored doing that. They think it's a good idea. Take at least some of the more intensive partisanship ripples out of the process. Long and short of this, whether you ask the state of Illinois or the people of Southern Illinois about virtually any of these reforms, we're for all of it. We're in favor of trying something different, basically, which kind of is consistent to the conviction that we're kind of wrong track and need to do some things differently. I think this is probably also a vote of no confidence in the current leadership and immediate past leadership. And if you're Pat Quinn running for re-election or Congressman Inyard running for re-election, can't have been good news in terms of this context being as cynical, as critical, as convinced that we're on the wrong track as it turned out they were. Ordinarily, it's very, very difficult to beat an incumbent, but it's not impossible. And when you get these midterm elections, which are particularly low turnout elections, and this was a massively low turnout election. This, by the way, you may not know, was the lowest turnout election since 1942 at the midterm level. Anybody remember what was happening in 1942? We were in the height of World War II, and a lot of people had to get absentee ballots and didn't actually have a chance to get to the polls, right? This was the worst turnout election since 1942. And that's a big part of what happened. Democrats knew they had a turnout problem. You always heard near the end of the vaunted Democratic Party ground game. I often try to doubt that excuse myself in terms of analyzing at least the possibilities of what might change. Didn't happen. Vaunted Democratic Party ground game, which had been tried and tested in both 08 and 12 at the presidential level, simply failed, and Democratic constituencies stayed home in droves on November the 4th. Now let's shift to something, if reform is not your cup of tea, let's talk about the social issues, which are always hot button issues, always controversial, starting with abortion, pro-choice, pro-life, which is table 3, page 15. The overall summary there, I'm going to collapse some of the responses just to be coherent here. Some variation on the pro-choice position is heavily favored over pro-life, over a pure pro-life position. If you collapse legal always and legal under certain circumstances, this is well over a majority in support of the pro-choice position statewide. The pure pro-life position in that table is 19.1% in 2010, 15.5% at the last level, which is 2014. This pure, what I'm calling a pure pro-life position, has declined, but only marginally, by about 5%. Southern Illinois voters, interestingly enough, deviate here from the statewide norms more than any other thing we study. We are more pro-life in Southern Illinois than statewide by a considerable margin, but having said that, we are still more pro-choice than pro-life. Indeed, we are more than a majority is pro-choice, not pro-life. The pure pro-choice in Southern Illinois is 19.85, or round off 20%. Abortions legal under certain circumstances are always legal is 49 and a fraction in Southern Illinois, so it's right on the cusp of being 50%. The two pro-choice positions are clearly much more favored statewide than they are in Southern Illinois, but still right at a majority in Southern Illinois. Now, let me tend to this thing for just a minute. I meant to turn that stupid thing off and forgot to. It keeps bonging at me here, and I don't want to be distracted. Let's look at legal rights for gays and lesbians, which is table 4, page 16. Another hot button social issue, and this is the one that has changed more than any other issue since we've been doing our studies, which is now 5 or 6 years. The statewide support for equal rights for gays and lesbians is now well over a majority statewide, 53.4%, with 23.1% supporting civil unions, 17.2% saying no recognition of legal rights to marry. That is really stuff you have to look at appendix, and by the way, the appendix in the back has a lot more detail here, but if you look at that, you will find that number. I think this was a movement, and I think it was led by activists and interest groups and encouraged by at least some parts of the media. And it changed over that 5-year period very dramatically. You may remember we had no recognition of rights for gays and lesbians to marry, to civil unions, which was the law for 3 years. We went from civil unions 2 years later to full equal rights, and we changed very quickly at the state level. Again, partisanship matters. Democrats, as you might expect, are much more in favor of this than Republicans. Independents are, again, right in the middle between Democrats and Republicans. But I think here winning over the independents has probably been critical, and certainly the independents are much closer to the Democratic position than to the Republican position on this. Southern Illinois voters allowing gay couples to marry, 28% favor of that position. Civil unions, 21%, so 28 and 21, you get 49 there. Again, 1 percentage point other. No recognition for legal rights for civil unions is 44%. So in Southern Illinois, we are further out of step with the state than on any other issue. We are, to summarize, much more conservative on that issue and much further out of the state norm on that particular issue. Now, again, I think, what does this mean for the election we've just seen? I think it has some pretty obvious and interesting implications. That is, you didn't hear Bruce Rauner talk about either one of these issues. And unlike Bill Brady, it wasn't real clear where he stood on these issues. And all you got out of Rauner was he talked about his wife, who was in favor of both of these social issues. He never told us exactly, as far as I know, where he was, but he often pointed to his wife. And he was not dumb about this. He read the same polls that I read and others read, and he understands that statewide, lay aside Southern Illinois, these were losers for a Republican candidate, and indeed were a big part of why Bill Brady wasn't elected governor in 2010. And particularly, if you look at Republican women and independent women in Cook County and in the suburban collar counties, Rauner was not Bill Brady on this stuff. He talked incessantly about the economy, he talked incessantly about jobs. He never really talked much about any of these hot-button social issues. And it worked pretty well, actually. He's going to start being governor real soon. Here, partisanship and ideology, of course, do about what you would expect. And I'm going to take those up next because those are the two most powerful predictors of how people are going to vote. And we've measured ideology and we've measured partisanship for a very long time. Let me start with ideology. You may not recognize, but there is a real advantage nationwide to being a conservative over being called a liberal. Being called a liberal is actually a bad word for a very large percentage of the American population. And that's why Democrats often run as progressives rather than liberals. Conservatives and/or the media have made being a liberal a bad, negative connotation, kind of label. And Democrats tend to run away from that and call themselves progressives, as I said. There's a gap of about 2 to 1. Round numbers nationally, about 40% of the American people call themselves conservative, and only about 20% consistently call themselves liberal, with the rest left over as moderates. There has been some decline of that gap recently, though. We have been going a little bit up on the liberal side in terms of the number of people who call themselves liberal nationally, and the gap is closer in Illinois. There are, in other words, more Illinois people who will call themselves liberal than there are nationwide. That doesn't mean we are a liberal state in terms of self-identification, but the gap is closer between liberal and conservatives. We lean a little bit more to the left than the nation as a whole. Okay? Let me shift this piece of paper. In southern Illinois, 22.5% of us call ourselves liberal, 24% call ourselves conservative or moderate, and 49% call ourselves conservative. So on self-identification, what we call symbolically, southern Illinois is almost 50% conservative. Now, I failed to make one point earlier that I should have made. When we define southern Illinois in our polling, it is literally southern Illinois. It's the 18 counties south of I-64, except we don't do the metropolitan urban area of St. Clair and Madison. So keep that in mind. If we were doing the urban areas, southern Illinois would look somewhat different, but we don't for various purposes. Southern Illinois is 18 real deep southern Illinois counties. Party identification, Democrats have an advantage nationwide over Republicans. At the time we were doing this poll, 49% of the nation as a whole called itself Democrat. Democrat plus leans Democrat. 6% call themselves pure independents, and 35% call themselves Republicans. So, Democrats have an advantage on partisanship. Now that sounds a little incongruous because I just said conservatives have the advantage on self-identified ideology. So it's not exactly the same thing, although there's a fairly high correlation. There is a greater advantage in Illinois to being a Democrat as opposed to being a conservative or a Republican, with the independents somewhat in between. Now, another interesting thing about that is in the state of Illinois and in southern Illinois, both partisan groups have grown over the last 5 years. There are now more Democrats in Illinois than there used to be, and there are more Republicans in Illinois than there used to be, and there are fewer independents, which is we are a very polarized nation, and we are deeply polarized from a partisan viewpoint. There are fewer moderates and fewer independents than there used to be. We're choosing up sides, and we're fighting all the time, and we're gridlocked, and we're angry and mad at one another all the time because of what's called polarization. And this is a part of that polarization. It's not the kind of thing you would expect from a common sense standpoint. There are more partisans than there used to be, fewer independents than there used to be. Okay, in southern Illinois, we are 13% less Democratic than the state as a whole, and we are about 2% more Republican than the state as a whole. So we are like the state, but not quite exactly the same. I said 2% less, I meant 2% more if I said less on that. All right, now we'll shift gears again and look at budget and tax issues. Let's look at Table 6, which is on page 21. Budgets are important, folks, and we're seeing that in the aftermath of this election with the threatened budget cuts that we at SIU and the people over at John A. Logan and all around are beginning to try to struggle with at the prodding of Governor-elect Roundman. People always talk about they're going to be the education governor or the education president. And there's an awful lot of rhetoric around about how much importance they put on education, for example. Well, look at where they put their budget emphasis and you'll get their real priorities. And that's what we've been interested in for a long time. The American public in general don't know much about budgets. And they've been fed mostly a line about budgets. They are really abysmally ignorant when you do public opinion polling. If you look at the national data, what would you think is the #1 item that most people think is the biggest single budget item in the federal budget? Anybody want to hazard a guess? Yes, sir.
Military.
You would think, and military may be a form of this, but that's not precisely the answer. Foreign aid. People will claim at about 50% level that foreign aid is the biggest item. Now, military is related to foreign aid, certainly. Foreign aid is actually less than 1%. It's about 0.5. It's a minuscule part of the federal budget, and yet people think we're just throwing money away all over the world, and that if we just quit giving it away over there, we'd all be all right. Nothing remotely like that when you look at the real numbers. Actually, Medicaid, Medicare, education, military, those are the big ones. Social Security, for example, depending on how you look at it.
Could you repeat those for us, where the expenditures are out a little louder? What you said.
Okay, the big ones are Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, military. All of those are the really huge items. Various parts of the education budget, but those are the big ones. Certainly not foreign aid. Again, you can't get public opinion to even think about what the realities of budgeting. And I think we've seen that played out, particularly in Illinois, throughout our entire lifetime. We've been fed a bill of goods over and over and over again in Illinois about budgeting. And we may be about to face up to some of the nonsense that we've been told and believed and voted for on the budget front. I'm not sure yet, but certainly there's a possibility that we've pushed this particular form of budgeting that we've had in Illinois to its final logical extreme and can't push it any further. Table 6, page 21. We've asked over and over again, how would you handle the budget deficit? Because in Illinois, we've had a budget deficit for now well over 10 years. More revenue, meaning taxes. 7 to 9% will endorse taxes. Raising taxes in any form is always unpopular, and the candidate who runs against that is always favored. Because nobody wants to raise taxes and nobody wants to run on that particular platform. The favorite is always cut waste, which is the next one down. Those who feel that the government is bloated and that there are way too many governmental employees and that there's all kinds of waste out there are always well over a majority, whether you look nationally or at the state of Illinois. The problem is one person's waste is another person's absolutely essential program. Was it waste, for example, to have Thames Prison? Was it waste to have the Murfreesboro Youth Center? Was it waste to have the Employment Security Office that was in Murfreesboro and that got closed? Just to hit Alexander and Jackson counties, for example. Waste is usually in the eye of the beholder, and it means in somebody else's district, or down here it always means in Chicago, of course. Yes.
How was the previous 3 years, the tax increase, how was that allocated
Well,
or spent?
Well, as a matter of fact, that's a good point, and people have no idea, and nobody believes this, but we were at about $10 billion in arrears on the bad bills that had stacked up when that thing came online. We went from 10 billion to 4 billion. I didn't hear anything about that during the campaign. 10 billion, we're still 4 billion behind, but we paid off 6 billion. Now, we also spent some new money and did some other things, and that was all you heard about, was we spent some new money and did some other things. That's what the General Assembly and the government wanted to do, and that's the way it worked. And that particular thesis prevailed in terms of what had happened. Basically, I think people who followed budgets and knew anything at all about it knew that we were going to have huge problems if we took the increase off. People always termed it, do you want the income tax increase? Well, it wouldn't have been an increase. It would have been keep the income tax at what it was for the last 3-4 years. But that wasn't the way the argument got cast. A combination of both, I'll come back to you. Generally, 26 to 29% said a combination of both. I think that's a perfectly reasonable place to stand myself, but only 26 to 29%. Well over a majority said, let's just cut waste. Well, yeah,
Well,
good, yeah.
Do you think if we would keep the tax on, we could further reduce our liability to 4 billion? Could we get it down?
Well, it depends on the General Assembly and the governor, but they did, in fact, get it down by 6 billion over a 3-year period of time. So
I don't think we can do without it,
we're
quite frankly.
clearly not going to do it otherwise. We're still going to have that backlog of $4 billion worth of debt.
John, how much did that increase in revenue? I mean, they paid off $6 billion.
Yeah.
But how much actual money came in for that same period of time?
Well, it runs about 3 to 4 billion a year in terms of
So they
the
had
new.
12 billion, so they had an additional
Yeah.
$6 billion to play with.
Yeah, and that's a very good question. That's my next point. We asked Table 7, page 23, do you want to make the income tax permanent? Well, no. Nobody wants to make the income. Well, a few people did. Pat Quinn did, to his credit. Pat Quinn, in my view, told the truth about this, because starting January the 1st, we have looming this fiscal year a $1.6 billion hole now opening up in this fiscal year. And those of you who've tried to manage budgets, as I have, I'll tell you, you can't get halfway into the fiscal year and then start finding major money to cut out of your budget. You're committed because mostly it's in personnel and you got contracts. And those of you that manage budgets don't have to elaborate. We're looking at a hole opening up of 1.6 billion this year. Next year, we're looking at anywhere from 4 to 5 billion by all objective analyses. We've got a $4 billion backlog of bills, so we're minus $9 billion at that point starting in 16. And that's why Rauner is scaring us to death at university level, where he sent out this edict that we're to think about cutting 20 to 30% out of our FY16 budget request. We've already lost $45 million out of a $245 million base from the state over the last 10 years. We're at 200 now. We were at 245. And if he comes for anywhere near that, there's going to be a lot of blood on the floor. And the numbers that Randy Dunn put out this week to the faculty were more than 300 positions at SIU, more than 200 positions lost at SIU Edwardsville, and over 100 positions lost at medical school. That would be basic losing a major factory. In fact, more than that, because these are by and large good paying and not hourly wage kinds of jobs. I don't think it's going to be that bad, by the way. I certainly hope it's not going to be, because we've already given over and over again. We are, by the way, a little factoid for you to take home with you. As I said, most of this money is always in personnel. We are the lowest state in the nation already in terms of the numbers of state employees per capita. We're number 50. So you can talk about all those lazy state employees out there that aren't working. There may be a few of them. There always are in any big organization. But we're certainly not fat by national standards and haven't been.
How did we get in that position?
We messed up budgeting in Illinois for a very long period of time. Under both Democratic and Republican governors, but increasingly under Blagojevich. And to some extent, Pat Quinn didn't rectify the whole thing, but he was aided and abetted by every General Assembly, as was every other governor aided and abetted by every General Assembly. And what I object to is we just had a statewide campaign, we had a bunch of local campaigns, and in my view, nobody talked turkey about this. Nobody gave you the facts of life. And everybody that I know that ran in Southern Illinois said, yeah, I'm opposed to that income tax staying on. And oh, by the way, I'm going to work like the devil to get TAMS reopened in Illinois. I will be careful here, but I will say John Bradley, I'd give him one kudo here. Bradley voted for the income tax increase, but not another Democrat or Republican in Southern Illinois voted for that. I bring this up because this is where we live. And certainly those of us that are connected to either Logan or SIU Carbondale or connected to any high school or any elementary school are going to be looking at the consequences of what we've just done. Let's look at Table 8, page 23. We've asked consistently, where do you want to cut? And the overall answer is nowhere. We don't want to cut anything. We like it all. You can go cut somebody else's, but we got to have TAMS, and we got to have John A. Logan, and we got to have SIU Carbondale, and leave us alone. We started with education, K through 12 and universities. We went down through public safety, state police, natural resources, state parks. Interesting enough, even programs for poor people, which was a surprise to me, programs for the disabled, public pensions, all of them, more than a majority, wanted to keep. Unfortunately, the only close to exceptions to that rule was a fair number of people wanted to cut the universities and public pensions. I didn't like the answer on either. And somehow another seemed to quit preaching and gone to meddling, as they say. I didn't think those were great. But those were the only two even remotely close to majority, if you look carefully at that table. One of the things we've done at SIU, just trying to deal with the cuts we've already taken, is we have more than doubled tuition over the last 10 years. It's way more expensive to go to SIU now than it was when some of you or your children or grandchildren went there. Party differences, they are about as you would expect. We do a crosstab, figure 6 through 12, which is page 25 to 28. Not surprisingly, Democrats are much more favorable toward the public programs and services and less willing to cut them than Republicans are, and the independents are always laid in between. But interestingly enough, a plurality and often a majority of Republicans don't want to do any of these cuts. Democrats are more pro-public service, but Republicans, plurality and often a majority, want to keep them. Now, quickly, there is a political science term for this. It's called being symbolic conservatives and operational liberals, we call it. We like our services, we want to keep them, particularly if they have anything to do with us, our family, our children, our grandchildren, or any of those things that we value, but we want basically someone else to pay for them. We hate the taxes that are required to pay for those services. We have a constitutional provision since 1970 in the Illinois Constitution requiring a balanced budget every year. And for the last 10 years, the General Assembly has consistently ignored what is clearly a constitutional provision. They can't do that, can they? Well, they did. And did anybody run against them because did any of them lose their job because they basically made up the numbers, particularly on the income side?
Can you impeach somebody for malfeasance in office?
Well, you'd have to get the General Assembly to do that.
That's how I
General
meant. I'd like to do them.
No, probably not. Actually, you can't. You can't, they're basically sovereign. You can't do anything to them. 10 years, we haven't balanced the budget in the state of Illinois. Table 9, page 29. I promise I'm hurrying through this. I want to save some time for discussion, and I know I've thrown a lot of numbers at you, but I hope I'm convincing you that what I'm telling you is also backed up by some real numbers, not just me pontificating. Oh, there was some of that too. Rauner and Quinn had an argument about this. Rauner said more prosperity, more jobs growth, natural growth in the budget would take care of it. And Quinn endorsed the income tax increase being made permanent. Turned out it was not an advantage for Mr. Quinn because overwhelmingly people were not in favor of that, about 2/3 overall. We looked at other sources of revenue. Raising the sales tax, broadening the sales tax base, which is my favorite, expanding gambling, tax retirement income or tax retirement income for those making above $50,000. The only one that even reached toward plurality level for people to favor was to increase gambling and increase the take on those above $50,000 on income. And both of those have some very real limits on how much they raise. If General Assemblies nationwide are really forced to the wall and really forced to raise taxes, they always turn to the so-called sin taxes first. They'll go for gambling every time. No matter that there are clearly limits to how much you can raise off of gambling, and no matter that there are clearly social costs very much associated with gambling. We have surrounded by states that push gambling harder than we do. We've got this new boat over in Cape. You can't turn on the tube without seeing advertising for the Isle Casino over in Cape. It's bound to be hurting the boat down at Metropolis, and that's fairly typical. There are real problems with using gambling as a major source of income. It's just an easy way out if you're going to force legislators to vote for a tax increase. You could hit people that are retirement age. I think that one's a legitimate one to talk about. You could hit people retirement age above 50,000. That's another debate that we could have. But smoking and gambling, they're always, chewing tobacco, they're always where people turn. George.
Why is it so difficult for them to get gambling in Chicago?
That's a very good question. If I lived in Central City, Chicago, and was surrounded by jurisdictions, particularly Indiana and everywhere around, and General Assembly tells me I can't have a moat, or a casino, and I think they've got cause for complaint there. How is it that Metropolis is more responsible than Chicago? I don't know. General Assembly's never been willing to give Chicago an outlet. And they're not happy
That's
about
where all
that.
the money's at.
Well, yeah, the mayors wanted to put one out at O'Hare and fleece all the tourists coming to O'Hare. And the General Assembly, which belies the myth that Chicago runs the place. Chicago's got 20%, and that's it. And the mayor's got to have some allies, and he hasn't been able, any mayor, to find the allies to get that thing done.
I was just up in Wisconsin, and you looked at the parking lot, there's a gambling casino.
Oh, yeah.
Half of them were on North Place.
Oh, yeah.
Well, there's three in the Chicago area.
Yeah, but they're,
Joliet, Elgin, and Aurora.
yeah, but they're not feeding Chicago's coffers.
Right, that's
Yeah,
true.
yeah, they're feeding Joliet's coffers quite nicely. But yeah, anyway, that's a constant complaint to people of Chicago. Okay, I want to bring this to a conclusion, to close, what I think is worth taking home out of this. We call this paper a dilemma of democracy in the subtitle, and what we find in Illinois is really true nationally, and I've already pointed toward it. We will vote ourselves services, we will vote for those who promise programs, we will vote for those who promise to keep Tams and Illinois youth and Harrisburg youth and Centralia and all of that open, but we won't vote for those who want to either keep our taxes or raise our taxes. We'll vote for those who want to cut our taxes. That's the way we are as a people, nationally and in Illinois.
How do you know what they're gonna do? Because they just badmouth the other candidates. They don't tell you what they're gonna do.
Well, we ought not settle for that, and the media ought not settle for that. That's pretty much what happens, I agree. But I'm calling for us to do better than that in the political discourse. It ought to be more rational and fact-based, and it ought to recognize some of these hard truths. At the same time, as I've already said, while we don't like the revenue side, we want to keep what we've got, and we get really mad, and our state representatives just raise all manner of cane if they lose anything or even threaten to lose anything. Again, in the terminology, we as a people are symbolic conservatives and operational liberals. And it's a democracy, so public servants give us what we want, basically. They vote for the stuff they think we will support, and we reward them. Carl.
You know, while I don't think any of us are in favor of deception, and you just pointed out the basic problem. We want the services, but we don't want to pay the cost of them. Politically, might the answer be to hide the cost? I mean, in terms of, I notice local governments are depending more and more on utility taxes. And you know, you get your utility bill, so there's $8 for the local government. Who cares? You know, and it seems like it's...
Well, I'm not in favor of hiding stuff, but yeah, I'm in favor of transparency. But it, practically it may come down.
None of us are in favor of it.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, like the one idea the Green Party had that I really thought had some merit is that tax on exchanges on the Chicago Board of Trade.
Yeah, and the last time...
Who would even pay attention to
Yeah,
that?
but the last time they trotted that out, the Board of Trade threatened to move to Indianapolis, and so they quickly folded their tent. Dorothy?
I'd like to go back to the question put to you about the major costs nationally. You mentioned Medicare, Medicaid, military, etc. My question is, what is the cost to us of continuing the deficit? Isn't that a considerable item in the budget? And along with that, what has it cost us on the state level for being in arrears? Haven't we increased our obligation by not paying out?
Well, yes. Certainly it's a bigger problem at the state than at the national level. We have actually cut the deficit, the operating deficit, very substantially over the last 3 or 4 years. We're at about 2.89, the last I saw just a few weeks ago, of GNP or GDP. We were at about 6. So we've cut the relation of the deficit and the total aggregate number on the deficit at the national level. And there are many debates about this, but there are economists that are reputable that would say the federal government can run a deficit. The fight's over how much, but we've been running a deficit since the last 2 years of the Bill Clinton administration, 3 years. That's the last time, and the only time in the last 50 years at the federal level we had a positive there. But that's because of the Federal Reserve. You can't run, as you undoubtedly know, a deficit indefinitely at the state level. And so we've pushed that out to its limit now. We're at the point where we're being punished in the money markets for the size of the deficit at the Illinois state level. So it's not really the same thing as the federal deficit. And we're going to try to figure out what to do with that. I've got a couple of other concluding points, and then I want to come back if I could. I've already started on this. We really just don't want to vote for the people who tell us the hard truths. We don't reward them. In fact, we punish them. Paul Simon's next to the last book that he wrote was about pandering. And if you've had a chance to ever read that book, it just drove him crazy. And I honor his legacy by pointing out that we tend to vote for those who pander to our worst instincts. And you can't keep on doing that. You have to, sooner or later, start figuring out a way to pay up, at least at the state level. National is a whole different argument, and even at that level, we've been doing a lot better lately than most people realize. The other point I wanted to make is we in Illinois for the last 10 years, since 2002, 12 years, have been called a deep blue state because we vote for the Democrats for both governor and president, and have since '92 when Bill Clinton ran the first time. Well, this last election, I think, served as a reality check. I had always said, there's a guy named Paul Green up at Roosevelt University that has sort of become famous for talking about that. I've always said in rejoinder to Paul Green, we are a Democratic state that leans Democrat, but that the Republicans can win depending on the circumstance, depending on the candidate, depending on the campaign they run. And this last time proves it once again. We now have 3 state constitutional officers that are Republicans and 3 state constitutional officers that are Democrats out of this last election. We have 1 Democrat and 1 Republican United States Senator. We are leans Democrat, but certainly a state that the Republicans can win statewide. Mr. Rauner clearly proved that. We're going to come back to this in 16, but I don't think it's at all adequate to say that Illinois is a Democratic state. No matter what happens, they're all going to vote for the Democrats, and it's all because Chicago's always going to vote for the Democrats. As a result, we got 2 different outcomes at the federal level as opposed to the state level. At the federal level, we've got what was already divided government, much more deeply divided government come January. The Senate, as you know, changed hands. The House got to be more Republican than it's been since before Franklin Roosevelt. That's how big the Republican majority in the House now. Republican majority in the Senate is going to be 56-44, and Democrats lost 9. I've already given away the Louisiana race. We had divided government. We're going to have deeply divided government at the federal level. I don't think that augurs well for what's about to happen at the national level. I think we're already seeing the signs of even more deep partisan gridlock. I think it's going to be next to impossible for President Obama to do anything of any note for the next 2 years, and I think we're going to have deep partisan conflict, and the media are going to love it because they lap up partisan conflict and ideological conflict, and that feeds back in and exacerbates the conflict at the local level. And keep in mind, 2016 started before November the 4th, and it intensified on November the 5th. We're knee-deep in the presidential election, and nobody's going to do anything while we stop and fight the presidential election. And that's the way our system works or doesn't work, because there's always another election just around the corner, 2 years for the House and midterm elections, and we don't get midterm elections behind us till everybody's choosing up sides and running for president. James Madison wrote the Constitution that way. He wrote it for a system that just barely works because of checks and balances, and it only works if people are willing to compromise and people are willing to look for the sort of common ground. And I haven't seen much sign of that in Washington. I don't think it's going to get any better. I am more cautiously optimistic about the state of Illinois. I think Rauner may work reasonably well with both Madigan and John Cullerton, and he'll certainly work okay with the Republican leadership. Rauner strikes me as more pragmatic than ideological and more driven by ambition and more of an opportunist than anything else. Not surprisingly, most successful politicians are. I don't think he's as dug in on sort of the standard talking points that you would get from a new Republican governor. I think there's a decent chance that he and Madigan and Cullerton are going to have to get serious about the depths of this budget problem, and particularly now the looming pension crisis, because the state Supreme Court's almost certainly going to throw out the pension compromise bill, and they're going to have to start over there. And so I think there's some chance that in Illinois we won't go deep partisan polarization direction that the nation's going to go. But we'll see. The more I've seen since the election, the more I've become convinced that we may be about to see a fairly productive first General Assembly, but in Illinois you never know for sure. I'm just guessing how those leaders will get along and how they're going to work. So those are my thoughts about mostly state and some federal issues. I'll be glad now to respond or duck for the under the table. Yes, sir.
We're told that the answer to our budget problems are industry and labor. What are the answers? How do we accomplish more industry in Illinois, especially southern Illinois?
Well, the problem, of course, is every other state and every other locality doing the same thing. And everybody's out there looking for the same. And, you know, we're up against a whole bunch of other people who've been told the same thing. It probably won't surprise you to know that I think education and good education systems is a key part of that. I think our community colleges do a great job of getting people ready for the jobs that exist out there, and we've got to keep at that. I think SIU Carbondale does a great CTC, or School of Technical Careers, always out here on the Carterville campus, now on the airport campus. We've got the best automotive and the best aviation programs in the country. Those are the kinds of programs that we've got to have a trained, educated workforce. And they can't all be just technically trained, although that's an important part of it. And instead, we're talking about cutting SIU and the community colleges by major amounts this next go-around. It's no accident that the nations that invest in education are also by far the most prosperous nations in the world. China is building 100 new research universities. 100. We only have about 100 total of real research-based universities. That's one part of it, clearly. And, you know, maybe Rauner will come up with some of that magic, but he's not the only governor that runs promising that a rising tide's going to lift all boats, but we don't have time for that in the next 18 months, because you're going to get new industry and new jobs. That's going to be out years, 3, 4, 5 years out. We've got to get from here to there, and I'm not clear how we're going to do that without serious damage. Yes.
If it were a perfect world, and you were the governor, and you had power, I have many friends who are in this pension crisis, not myself, but friends. How do you see that correcting itself? I mean, will people be able to say, okay, I'm grandfathered in, but it's going to be different for the guy who's just being hired? How do you perceive that?
Well, I think that right there is one possibility, that they leave alone the current employees that have retired and then fix. What Mr. Rauner wants to do is to go with a 401k kind of thing and change that all for the current employees and for all future employees. That's one possibility. A more radical possibility is we could have a constitutional amendment. Somebody might decide that that's the only way out, and the Constitution says what it says in pretty plain language. That's not to say that we couldn't change the Constitution. And those of us in the state system don't like the sounds of that, but our polls here show that the public, by and large, doesn't support public pension systems. I hate that as an outcome, but that's what the polls show.
Could it break the state in 2 years, or 10 years, or 5 years?
Well, technically, you can't break the state. I mean, it can get to be a bigger and bigger part of the total, but even the worst numbers are, it crowds out other spending as the, it's about $8 billion is what they've got to find right now to keep going and quit borrowing. Could grow to, the biggest numbers I've seen are about 10 billion. It's bad, but it's not as bad as is often, because Carl's probably more expert on this than I am. I suspect he studied this more carefully than I, but my understanding of that 100 billion is that's kind of the theoretical if we all went on retirement at the same time. We over at the Institute spent about 2 hours with John Cullerton about a year ago, and he said, look, you know, I'm really tired of this $100 billion thing. Nobody believes that $100 billion is real. You got to have $8 billion to pay what's required this year, and then you got to have $8 billion next year and $8 billion next year. Carl, you agree with that?
Yes.
And Cullerton's the guy that's right there on the fire. He's the president of the Senate, in case you don't recognize the name. Cullerton, I trust, knows what he's talking about. And I sat in a room way smaller than this where he assured us that the state can actually come up if we want to. But what we did was we borrowed, or we went on a pension holiday. Wasn't that a good thing to do? Which meant all of us paid our part and they didn't pay their part. And nobody, Bill.
Well, you touched on a question there I had. Being a fellow vet, I thought maybe be reassured that your fellow vets at the American Legion both working on the same problems you are, albeit at a lower intellectual level. About the second round we had after our post meeting, question was raised, hey, why didn't the state just declare bankruptcy? Is that an impossibility? That a state cannot do that?
I don't think the court will, the Supreme Court of the United States ultimately would be the arbiter. I don't think the court will allow a state to declare bankruptcy.
I mean, there's
You
like
can't.
no limit though. I mean, they can keep
Well,
borrowing and borrowing.
we may be about to plumb that limit
Well,
already.
that's what I'm thinking. Yeah, I know.
But we have all kinds of assets.
I do not think that, I don't think the legal system will allow it, basically. I don't think the Supreme Court of the United States.
Nobody to force going into these assets to start paying the debts off.
You know, you could turn every highway into a toll road, but I don't think.
And close every prison,
Well, I
close every university.
There's assets out there, but.
but
Yeah, I don't think that's the answer, and I don't think the courts will allow it.
okay. No, it was raised. Okay.
It's not the same as bankruptcy in a private sector, yeah.
I'm just curious because I just heard that Germany's now offering free education to all their people. I know France does, and some of the Scandinavian countries. Well, how can they do this? I mean, here universities are just scraping by, community colleges. Germany has one of the best workforces in the entire world. The Apple VI, most of it is made in Germany. It's put together in China, and everybody thinks it's made in China, but it isn't. The technical part's made in Germany because their workforce is so good. And we can't do that?
Well, we don't have the will to do it.
Okay, that's what I
We don't
thought.
have the political will to do it.
Don't you think we should?
Uh,
We're going
I
to
think
keep our
we should
place in the world?
I think we should do differently from what we're doing. Yes, sir.
Will you allow announcements?
Sure,
Okay.
absolutely.
I am Dennis Andrew Ball. I'm delighted to be here. I am from Arizona.
Oh,
Okay? Arizona had a budget problem too, back in 2010. Governor Brewer got busy with the assets in terms of selling assets, leasing back assets, cutting taxes, raising taxes in certain ways with the sunset law. She had a deficit, I think, somewhere around $2 to $3 billion. Now they have a surplus. They've attracted new business too into the state. And I don't know if you're familiar with Tesla Motors. They're creating, electric vehicles. They need battery factories. Arizona is very competitive in that respect, along with New Mexico and Texas. So Rayner has an opportunity. As a matter of fact, I was considering running for governor, except that I would not meet the residency requirements. And I wasn't going to pull an Obama. So I'm happy that he won. There's some other issues that I don't agree with, but he's got a chance to fix this economy in Illinois. And I think that's a real good thing. Now, the second announcement I have is this. I am a candidate for President of the United States, and I make it now. And I belong to the American Party of America, the AOA, the ANC, the American National Committee. And we are independents. And we believe that business, labor, and government work in the best interest of children, parents, and grandparents and follow the rule of law. What a noble thought. President Lincoln, in 1864, to his field commander Elkin, said, "I tremble for my country, for that which is happening in front of me." This is a civil war. Corporations are taking everything that America has to produce and amassing the wealth in a group of a ruling class. I fear that the rights and privileges of our country are going to go away for our individuals, and that we will all become pawns in the hands of others. That's where we are now. We have to change this. We have to make government work for our family. The family is the issue, and our kids are too, especially those little ones 3 to 11.
Thank you for
You
your
bet.
time. John?
George and then Cheryl.
One of the things that's going right now is, in Chicago, they want to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. In Springfield, I think they just passed the bill, the House did, or the Senate, for $11 an hour. What effect would that have in the future as far as being able to attract new industry or new businesses to Illinois? Have they projected anything as to what that's going to do in trying to get us out of this deficit hole?
Yeah, the General Assembly adjourned without acting on that, so they're not going to do it, basically. This is an interesting exercise in popular democracy. We just had a referendum on that issue, and it passed by 66% statewide. So we're not going to do it.
You're not going to do it.
No, we're not going to do it. I would say the thumbnail answer is economists have studied this every which way you can, different jurisdictions, different circumstances. The results are mixed. There are studies on both sides. On balance, there are more studies that show it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. It's not all it's cracked up to be in terms of killing jobs or whatever. And it's different by different industries. It's different if you're a state employee running a state operation. If you're running a private operation, you've got different sets of circumstances. And so people argue whichever side they want to argue on, and there's an economic study that will prove either side. But it's, I think, predominantly is it make a heck of a lot of difference. Yes?
I would like to make a comment on that, whether or not if you pay for it one way or the other, because if people aren't making a living wage, then you're supporting them
Right.
with food stamps. I mean, eventually, one way or the other, you're making up that difference if the company's not paying.
Yeah, there's that huge study of how much taxpayers subsidize Walmart, for example, because of,
And I don't like paying their.
yes.
Who do you follow for accurate information on the pension system? Do you follow what Romer's doing, what the Supreme Court's doing, what the associations like Illinois Retired Teachers? I mean, who do you tap into to see what's really get the best on the pension system? Best information?
I just read it all.
Okay.
I don't have a single source by any stretch. I'm underemployed, so I read way too much. I see all the arguments on all sides. But, you know, there are some really good, solid sources. The state sources are good. They will tell you the truth. You can go on the internet and read the various state sources and their assessment. The Chicago Civic Club is a good source for those kinds of studies. I think the basic facts aren't really in contention. Most people understand, I mean, most people that study this, the average voter is not paying enough attention, but most people understand that we've got a deficit and that we've got a pension problem that's going to have to be fixed. Yes. All right.
Well, I feel like I've had a semester of civics, which is really good. I mean, we got it all pretty, this has been wonderful. But it kind of makes me think a little bit, and we've talked about the education and the cuttings of education we know for a long time. A lot of classes being gone. We're missing civics in the schools, and that's probably why we've got all those missing. People don't know the truth and what their responsibilities are in the voting. And so I just want to say, this points out to me that this is the price we're paying for dropping those out of the curriculum.
Yeah.
Johnny, thank you. We're going to give you a round of applause. Everybody is welcome to stay.
Thank you. You're a good audience. I enjoyed giving testimony. I knew I would.
And also, I want to remind everybody, next Friday at 2 o'clock, the First Baptist Church in Energy, the historic church there. It's also our Christmas party, and if you come along, if you happen to bring some canned goods, that's good. We're going to,
We'll get this done.
Canned goods, we're going to take them down.
It's time to start somewhere.
They run out because of things.
The boomers.